Vado? Professor Goodhart, good evening. We're very happy to see that you are already online. We're just setting up our panelists, and we will start in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Prova, possiamo iniziare, siamo quasi tutti e mi dicono che possiamo iniziare. Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome again to the 11th edition of the Diplomacy Festival here in Rome, Italy. Now the conversation for the next hour or so will be about the so-called Great Demographic Reversal. This formula was invented by an English economist that is Charles Goodhart, that we are honored to have here, and he's online, actually, he's participating online. You all know him. He's been in academia, he's been in central banking and private banking. And a few years ago, he started working with Manoj Pradhan on a seminal book that's called The Great Demographic Reversal, Aging Societies, Waning Inequality, and an Inflation Revival. So aging society, inequality, and inflation. We have all the key words we will be debating about tonight. And I think there are at least two reasons that make the discussion about them more relevant here in this place and at this time. First reason is that the Diplomacy Festival, as you know, has a general title that is Managing Transformation in a No-Compass World. And somehow I think Goodhart's work pushes us to challenge mainstream and easy explanations of economic and social trends. And that is exactly what the author does when he doesn't stop, when he's trying to explain, for example, a long period of low inflation, and he doesn't stop at the role of government or central banks, but he looks into strong deflationary forces that are in the background and that work either we want it or not, such, for example, the demographic changes. Second reason for this debate to be so relevant is that we are hosting it in Italy, and the demographically oldest country in the world, along with Japan. And so maybe we are at the forefront somehow of this demographic reversal. Now, before giving the floor to Charles Goodhart, first let me introduce you also to the distinguished guests and discussants that we have here today. Alphabetical order from the left, actually also Andrea Brandolini, who's head of the Statistical Analysis Directorate in the DG Economics, Statistics and Research at the Central Bank of Italy. Then Massimo Pronio, head of communication at the European Union delegation in Italy, in Rome. And Maria Rita Testa, who's professor of demographics at the Lewis University in Rome. And we're waiting for Linda Laura Sabatini, who's central director of ISTAT. She will be here with us in a few minutes. But now I would say, Professor Goodhart, the floor is yours. I would ask you to present your thesis in, let's say, 8 to 9, 10 minutes, and then we will open the discussion here. We want to be sure we have time also to debate with so many young people and students who are here in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will not use slides on this occasion since the time is rather short. As I think all of you know, the basic concepts in economics are the interaction of demand and supply. What happens when anything has a massive increase in supply, effectively doubles within the space of a few years? And the answer is its price goes down. What I'm going to suggest is that the available supply of labor, particularly to Western economies such as Italy, effectively more than doubled within the last 30 years, but is going to turn around and decline from here on in. The first great factor driving demographic developments has been the changing pattern of women's fertility, with a surge in fertility in the couple of decades after World War II, what is known as the baby boom, followed thereafter by a very sharp decline in the fertility rate, now below the sustainable level. This had at least 3 effects on the availability of labor. First, it meant that as the baby boomers entered into the working age population from about the 1970s onwards, the working age population in all advanced economies grew fairly sharply. Second, with the very sharp decline in the number of young under the age of 20, and before the number of aged expanded sharply with longer life expectancy, the dependency ratio went down. Now, workers by definition are deflationary, since you don't pay workers as much as you expect the value of their products to produce. While dependents are by definition inflationary, since on the whole they don't work, but they consume. And therefore a improvement in the dependency ratio with more workers and fewer young effectively was deflationary in itself. Next, with the decline in fertility and the decline in the number of babies, and the increase in consumer durables, such as the refrigerators, so you did not have to go out and shop every day, the proportion of women working in the labor force, the participation rate rose very sharply. So not only was the working age population growing, but the participation rate of the working age grew fairly dramatically over this particular period. Beyond that, there was an increase in globalization, particularly with China and to a slightly lesser extent, Eastern Europe, entering the world's trading activities. And China is the most populous country in the world, with many more population than, for example, in Europe. And that meant that anyone who could shift their production from a high-wage economy, such as Italy, to a low-wage economy, such as China or Hungary, found it profitable to do so and did so. That also acted as a constraint on workers asking for more wages, because there was always a threat that if you try and raise your wages, we shall simply transfer our production to a low-wage economy. Thirdly, it meant that the workforce shifted from manufacturing, where they're relatively well organized in groups, in factories, to services where they're badly organized in very small numbers together. And that meant that the power of labor and the numbers in trade unions declined really dramatically. All that was very deflationary, and it occurred before the other great demographic effect, which was the rise in life expectancy, where life expectancy has grown by more than the increase in the age of retirement. So the period and numbers of those retired has increased really dramatically and sharply over these years. That meant that in the world as a whole, there were downwards pressures on wages, and equivalently, it meant that there was upwards pressures on those who could provide complementary factors of production, human capital, skills, managerial skills, technical skills, and financial and physical capital. And the last 30 or so years have been a dramatically good time to be a capitalist because you were doing extremely well as a result. What all this led to, of course, was a huge increase in within-country inequality, as the generally lower paid workers with nothing to sell but their labor effectively lost ground continuously, while the capitalists did extremely well. But on the other hand, there was a very considerable decrease in inequality between countries as the lower wage areas, which had joined the world's trading system, China and Eastern Europe, were catching up with the West, Europe and North America. Now, all this is effectively going into reverse as globalization is weakening with the US-China spat and the effects of COVID showing all of us that we need to have our major manufacturing production onshore. And with the rise in the number of retirees, so the ratio of dependents to workers is worsening year after year. And we, the old, are very expensive. Not that we consume more food or buy more clothes than the rest of you, but the reason why we're expensive is that a lot of us become incapacitated, and the diseases of the old, mostly neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Parkinson's, have not been cured in the very slightest by medical advances, unlike the great advances in cardiovascular and cancer research. And looking after the old, care for the old is very expensive, is also very labor intensive. And that means that insofar as the state looks after the old via pensions and medical care, Medicare and so on, it is going to worsen the budget year after year after year, unlike COVID, which is a relatively short-term blip. Now, politically, it's extremely difficult to cut back on the benefits for the old because the old vote en masse and wouldn't like it. It's equally extremely difficult to raise taxation on the younger workers because they don't like that either. And if you try and raise interest rates significantly at a time when debt ratios, both public sector and private sector, are so very high, the increase in interest rates will cause great problems both to the public sector and the private sector, and will be resisted politically, and could, if pushed too far, cause collapses in asset prices and a depression, which is the reason why we think that the politically most attractive outcome is going to be a continuation of a moderate degree of inflation. So there, in a nutshell, is what we have as our forecast. We've got more inflation, we've got less inequality as a reduction in the labor availability and the shortage of labor, which has now been occurring much more rapidly than we thought because of COVID, bring up wages, reduce profitability, and So waning inequality. We do think that productivity per head will rise. The great counter to our argument has always been Japan, which aged before anyone else. The reason why the Japanese didn't have higher wages and more inflation is because their near neighbor China was disinflating the world in the meantime, and the Japanese were shifting their production and manufacturing production en masse into Asia, particularly in China, and the stable, high-paid wages in manufacturing in Japan were being shifted or falling, and what was growing in Japan was part-time working in the services sector, which was much more insecure. So the problem with looking at Japan is you have to look at these things in a world context rather than in the context of a single economy, which is one of the reasons why people worrying about the Phillips curve have not been looking at the right kind of analysis. But I think I've probably gone on for at least my allotted length of time, and I'm very happy to pass over to the very eminent and prominent panel whom you have before you. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you, but there are a number of reasons why that has been impossible. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me pass over to the panel. Hello. I thought I was transferring to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Goodhart. It was perfect timing also, and you were really clear in your explanation. Thank you very much. Now, you already touched some interesting topics, and we will be likely be able to cover them because we have panelists from different backgrounds also. I will start with the economist, Andrea Brandolini from the Central Bank of Italy. Before your comments, I'm also intrigued by the underlying critique that Mr. Goodhart moves to institution and mainstream economists when basically pointing to the fact that they tend to have a short-sight view and short-term view, while powerful forces like demographics tend to work in the long term. And especially there are sometimes forces that are out of our control. But I also know you are interested in giving some comments on inflation and inequality. So please now, Andrea Brandolini, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So good afternoon and many thanks for this invitation and thanks for this opening to this meeting. Let me say that it is for me a great pleasure to be here to talk after Professor Goodhart, not only because I was lucky to attend this course on monetary policy at the LSE over 30 years ago, so many years ago, it was 88, and so I adapted that Professor Goodhart remembers that. But because I think that his book with Manoj Pradhan raises very interesting and intriguing points. It's a very provocative book, really worth reading. And I'm not saying this because I'm commenting, but because I think that. So I don't want to enter here into a discussion of the point of the book that is attracting much attention within central banks. And it is the book Prediction about the future of inflation. But let me make just one very quick point and to move to other issues, more in the spirit of the question of our moderator. So in the postscript, the book was written before the pandemic, and it has a short postscript written, I think, summer 2020, or something like that. The book was published in August 2020. And in that postscript, the authors suggested that the inflation rate could go up this year up to 5% and even more, even 10%, as always after the war. Incidentally, let me open a parenthesis. I'm not very happy taking the parallel of a war for the pandemic. Of course, there are issues that are similar, but unlike the wars, there are not people fighting each other. And more importantly, from the economic point of view, there are no physical destructions. So I would be careful in using the parallel with the war, but that is something very common. So close my parenthesis. So the prediction of 5% of inflation rate, even 10% made last year, actually is not too far away from the numbers that we are seeing now in some countries, namely in the US. In the US, the debate is very lively about the inflation. Even if it is the inflation rate much lower in Europe, is we have in certain countries slightly higher percentage rates, but we are not far from the target of the Euro system in Europe. So to make the story very short, I could quote, because I think it is a fair summary, what Gita Gopinath said recently at an ECB conference where Professor Goodhart was also a panelist, that the baseline is for transitory but elevated inflation for a few quarters. So the crucial word is transitory and temporary. So in our analysis in central banks, at least in Europe, we cannot see, I would say yet, but we have no elements to think that this rise of the inflation rates is anything that temporary. There are, of course, upside risks linked to the bottlenecks that we see in production, to the interruptions in global value chains, and so forth. But there is no need to say that these risks are carefully monitored by central banks. But so far, we haven't strong sign of a strong increase of inflation. So that is just to close on the inflation issue that I think is less interesting for our debate today. So apart from this, the book is, I think, as I said, is worth reading, has great merits, and it is full of insights. It's very forceful in the argumentation. So there are many different strands. Let me pick 2 points that in my view are important and that Professor Goodhart already briefly mentioned in his introduction. The first point is obviously from the title is the stress of the importance of demography. Demography is going to change in a way to make the world very different from the one that we know now. And I have no problems to take that. And actually, in my own work, I've been studying these issues, and I'm working with demographers, and the decline in fertility rate is something that worries and is a matter of debate among us. Aging is a well-known phenomenon, but one insight of the book that economists, or most of the economists, are not considering is that we should not look only at the lengthening of lives of people, but also at the actual conditions, the actual physical condition in which people, the elderly people live. So the emphasis on dementia is very well taken from a policy point of view and also from a well-being point of view, because we are talking about the condition of human beings. But staying in the economics, on the economic side, the issue of dementia and the related diseases means that caring for a growing share of means that we will have to care for a growing share of people that are not independent, that are not able to live on their own without help from outside. And this is a challenge that we will have to face very soon on a dimension that we haven't seen so far. It will be a great stress for health and welfare systems. So while the focus of the book is entirely correct on this point, there are 2 issues that are somewhat downplayed. The first is the role of automation and of science more generally. I think, in my view, automation and robots are often seen as a problem because they displace human human jobs. But in a context of shrinking working age population, they may actually compensate for the pressure on labor. So here we are talking about the future. It is just a matter of individual perception, but I tend to be slightly more, let's say, optimistic from that point of view on the possibilities of automations. And we should not forget about the great capabilities of science and scientific research. The development of a vaccine against COVID was extraordinarily rapid, but not because we jumped some stages in testing phase, but just because it was very rapid, the development itself. It was a great achievement of science worldwide. So, and why that? Well, because apart from the development of science, because we put a lot of resources to achieve that result. So let me say that I hope that as science was able to find a vaccine against COVID in a short time, also science will be able to find treatments and way to tackle dementia and other neurological diseases of the old age. And let me say that the search has already started. The second point that I find problematic from this perspective is the assumption that the welfare system will continue to protect the elderly as they do now. Professor Goodhart has just said that it is politically very difficult to cut off benefits to the elderly. Of course, the electoral majority of the old population is an important factor, but there are limits to that. And that is especially true, I think, when people realize that the elderly hold much of the wealth of nations. In Italy, we went through major pension reforms that were very painful for people that we are going to go on pension. So that is something that is achievable. And so cutting off some benefits when they are perceived as unfair is feasible. Do we have a few minutes? Yeah, okay. So, so that is the first great merit of the book. Let me take a second point that I find very important in the book that is very distinctive. And the fact that the book takes a global view. It might seem obvious in an integrated, globalized world. But the point of the book is that it is misleading to look at one area, however big, like, say, Europe or advanced economies, but in isolation. That would be, could give results that are misleading. So we should take this global view. And the point about inequality, the within versus between country changes, is a very important example of why it is important to take the global view. But what I would like to stress here is the issue of globalization, because this is central to our discussion today. The pandemic has fueled the debate on the role of global value chains, the way international production is organized. So the question is whether the global value chains have made participating countries more vulnerable to global shocks, whether this could lead to a reshoring of productive activities, and whether economic policies should intervene to encourage such a trend or to counteract such a trend. So there is in the political debate a lot of emphasis on the importance of resilient and robust production processes, something that should move in the direction of reshoring and being autonomous in the production. However, this deglobalization finds little support in the economic literature. In some cases, such as medical equipment, building independent, self-reliant, resilient supply chains might be the best way to decrease the vulnerability to external shocks. But this is not what we should pursue in general. It is the exception, not the rule. The point, and I come to my very last point, it is about policy and politics. The point is that the pandemic struck at a time when the political backlash against the globalization and the associated resurgence of protectionism was already underway. The ongoing problem on pandemic-related supply disruptions might reinforce these tendencies. The book has a chapter on the issue of the political consequences of globalization and the rise of populist movements and so on. Here, and I come to the critique of Professor Goodhart to mainstream economics, is that mainstream economics has too long ignored the critical implication of the fragmentation of production for income distribution and ultimately human well-being. We now know the problems, the consequences of technological advancement and globalization, and we should learn from the past. We must learn the lessons from the last decades, and this book is one book that helps us to move away from standard analysis and mainstream analysis. So if we want to preserve all the gains from international integration and from technology, I think it is very important to understand all their consequences. The point is not to give up, to renounce to the benefits of globalization or technology, but rather to strive to design policies that ensure a fair distribution of these benefits. So to close on the issue on which I've been working extensively, like inequality, that globalizations and technology increases inequalities, would say, was not and is not inevitable. And here I'm quoting Tony Atkinson, that was for sure a great man who strongly stressed this point in the past. So probably I've been too long, sorry. But
Thank you very much. And well, Professor Brandolini put a lot of focus also on the situation of the elderly people, the role of the older workforce. So now talking about demographics, I would give the floor to Professor Maria Rita Testa. She's a demographer. I think she will talk from there. Okay, she's a demographer, and maybe she can help us understand better what is happening to our population, even right here in Italy, not only to the older people and older workforce, but also to the younger part of the Italian society and also European society. So Professor Maria Rita Testa, now the floor is yours. Professor Goodhart, can you hear us? Can you hear us well?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you.
And I congratulate Dr. Brandolini. He obviously learned a lot when he was at LSE. It was a very
Okay, we will let you reply later then. And okay, Professoressa Testa, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. Welcome to all the students and also to all other students that are connected in other rooms. I have been told that there are other students spread around. My task today is to go a bit a step backward and make the point on demographics. I have heard from Professor Goodhart, he just jumped into low fertility. It was just at the beginning of his speech. I will talk about the Italian demography, the case of studies Italy. Apologize, you know, you might have more interest in American demography, but it is a good example also for the States. You will know why at the end of this speech. I will give you a broad overview. So long-term view. What did happen? Okay, and I deleted number 3 in my presentation because it was covered by Professor Brandolini, and so we were very well coordinated on this respect. The challenge. So here we are, the challenge ahead. Okay. So I have to tell you that in the last decades in Italy, the demographic debate was very hot. So the reason is, we will see whether it is well justified. The reason is that there is Italy holds always a record. Whatever demographic indicator we pick up, we are the champion. These are the example on how it was featured in the media, the demographic problem of Italy, the Italian demographic winter. You probably have heard about it. Italy, the demographic trap. We are going to shrink. We have heard from Andrea Brandolini, but this is a trap. Okay, we will lose our endogenous capability to reproduce. We'll see why. Italy, a country with empty curbs, no children anymore. So not the old stereotype, large families. And perhaps more in the literature, more specialized literature, Italy, the latest late transition to adulthood. The young Italians wait a long time before they go out, before they become autonomous, okay? So the reason, I mean, they are justified, this title, okay? Because as you may see, here is just a projection in the area where you see the blue color, just beside the curve. These are the confidence interval. This is a prediction, okay? While on the left side, it is observed data. You see the case of Italy, we went up, the Italian population went up till just the last years, and we are projected to decline. This is the medium variant of the population division, United Nations. And you may find it in the World Population Prospects 2019. It does not take into account the effect of COVID-19. So we have got good reason to be worried about it. We are going to be less than we were in 1950. 1950, 47 million, and by the end of this century, 40. Okay? So Italians have less children. This is the reason for this declining path, is that couples were for a long time, for several decades, from the 1970s, they were having less and less children. Now, the total fertility rate is 1.26 children after COVID. This is the last data. Do you know in the US how high it is? It is higher but declining. It is 1.64. And my American colleagues are very happy because it's declining, and they get resources to research, to make research on this issue, okay? So in Italy, it was declining since the 70s. We had a little, you may see here, a little recovery in Italian, la ripresina, in Italian we call like this, and now we are going to have less and less children. So this society cannot replace itself, because we need 2 children to replace the parents and to ensure the stability of a population, okay? So the good news for Italy is that we are also champion in life expectancy at birth. We were before COVID, we reached already 83 years. A newborn in Italy could expect to be alive 83 years. And after COVID, we lose 1 year. So nowadays it's 82 years. And the good news is that not only we are the champion of being so having this long life expectancy, but also there is a high number of years that Italians spend in healthy life. This is a key point. The problem is with the declining. I mean, it is simple a figure. We can't. I don't think that a figure can tell us much. So we are going to be less. It could be also a positive issue. We have, several towns like Rome that are a bit overcrowded. They have problems with these overcrowded areas. But the problem is, as Andrea Brandolini has already touched upon, is that we are going to see this declining path also of the segment of the population that is in working age. So this poses clearly challenges. There are going to be less people that contribute to economic growth of our country. So the issue here is we were aging since a long time, since the 1950s. But the issue is that at the beginning, the aging was produced at the bottom of this age pyramid. So couples were having less children, less and less children. So we had less young people and proportionally more old people, old age people. This was still a favorable condition because we had in the working age segment, the people born in the previous years when fertility was higher. Okay, so actually now, 2020, we are still having quite a lot of people in the working age segment of population in Italy. The challenge comes now because we are aging from the top, the so-called second aging. The first one from the bottom of the age pyramid, the second is from the top. So the old age people are not only reaching 65 years, but they are living longer. So we have to maintain these dependent people for longer time. And as Professor Goodhart neatly wrote in his book, actually several countries in the last decade have already put on some measures trying to just postpone the age at retirement to keep these old age people active for longer time. Okay, so the issue, so this is the demographic, okay? So we are moving toward this situation. 2050 has a higher certainty because a projection within a window of 30 years is pretty sure, okay? It's very slow, but it's pretty sure. The challenge is not in this figure, it's in the response. How could we respond to this different age structure in the population? So here we are. It seems to me that there is a convergence or correspondence between what the government set up, the Next Generation program. So it means that they care for the next generation. There should be a next generation if they call a program like this of recovery, okay? And so they are very well concerned about well-being, sustainability. And the individuals, several surveys show that the large majority of couples want still a family with 2 children. So it's not that couples do not care about having a family. So there is a kind of correspondence between what the government wants and what the couples want, this 2-child family. Whether this is a feasible target for a country like Italy, where the total fertility rate is 1.2, is another issue. So here I just put the area where we could try to insist and see whether we could support this fertility of 2 children per family. Because in the end, it's not only a matter to, to just sustain the people at the old age, but also to try to make the segment of those who are going to work larger. So which are the possible direction? Well, the literature says care. So the countries where childcare services are more of high quality and more numerous, they are doing better. They don't have a replacement fertility of 2 children per woman, but they have a fertility of 1.8. France, for example, or the Sweden, for example. Gender, the equality is also another important direction for intervention, because in those countries where equality is higher in the gender roles, not only in the system, so in the labor market, but also within the couple where equality is high, fertility is higher, and work, of course. This is the key point. Work here is the key point. How we could allow women to work in the family and in the market. And the example of Professor Goodhart in his book is that Japan, Japan is the oldest country in the world, but actually Japan performed pretty well. It was not in the same condition of Italy because he succeeds to improve the female labor force participation. Okay, here it comes the part that it is not purely demographic, but it lies on behavior. Okay, so, and I just conclude, yes, with these 2 slides. We have to know that when we look at the cross-country comparison, actually female employment is positively associated with fertility. So those countries that have higher female labor force participation do also have higher total fertility rate. And you see Italy in the bottom left corner of this area of graph area. And on the opposite, Sweden, UK, Iceland. Okay. And the second input, and then I just stop after this, is that in those countries where there has been higher public spending for family, for young, there has also been higher fertility. So there is also here a positive relationship. So actually, this is just a suggestion on how we could respond to the changing demographic structure of our country. Italy and the state, as I told you, is also registering a lower and lower total fertility rate. I stop here. Maybe a concluding remark. I had this beautiful map from Italy because, I talk about Italy as a whole, but the differences between regions are enormous. And actually, it has been found that in the regions where there are higher employment, higher economic well-being, higher quality of service, higher life satisfaction, there has also been a higher mean number of children. So there seem to be many positive relationships here. I leave it open.
Okay. Thank you to Professor Maria Rita Testa. Now I will give the floor to Massimo Pronio, Head of Communication at the European Union Delegation in Italy. We have talked about many facets of the demographic question. I think now we'll hear something about migration, and that's also part of the demographic balances and imbalances of our contemporary times. Mobility is at the center, is one of the main issues of the book written by Charles Goodhart. He talks a lot about mobility of capital. And okay, now Massimo Pronio, it's up to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Secretary General of the festival, Mr. Bartolomucci, to have invited me, because for me it's an honor to speak after Professor Goodhart. I studied his books, and his analysis is always a light in the dark. I want to touch a few points, but first I recall a rule that when I work in the European External Action Service, which will become the European Diplomatic Service, I had a managing director, Nicholas Westcott, who is a Foreign Office diplomat, and he always told me, Massimo, when you write a report, a political report, there are 3 rules: brief, brief, brief. So I'll be brief, and I'll touch a few points. Okay, Professor Goodhart has talked about women's fertility, a topic which has then been touched also by our Professor Testa. And I think that's a key element in today's demography. And demand and supply in economics, but also demand and supply of labor. So we have a Europe which is getting old, is feeling old, because when Europe called a new Marshall Plan the next generation EU, that shows already, like Professor, I could have written your slides, yeah. That shows already that Europe feels a bit old. And the eyes are on the future generation. And I have seen the creation of this program, but I have a question also for Professor Goodhart at the end of my short introduction. So this program is to relaunch our economies with our internal labor forces. But there are also thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are moving in the world. And people move because they look for better opportunities. If we think that women's fertility rate in Africa, it's extremely high. In average, we have in sub-Saharan Africa, a woman has between 7 and 9 children. So of course, when I served myself in Africa, I saw a lot of young people, a lot of children everywhere. So of course, if the states do not create creation of labor, because that's what we are asked when we are in these countries, always labor creation. Countries need stability. To have stability, they need people who are working and are busy working and are not creating riots in the street because they don't have work or because they're poor. So when you have a number of people which is really high, and women that do not have enough culture, let's say, and cannot enter the labor market, but are only occupied with making children, which is in many parts of the world is the main resources of income for the future of the family, then you have, of course, movement of people. And in Europe, we have a feeling that this mass migration is invading us. But in fact, if we look at the numbers, we saw that inside the continents, there are big numbers of migration. And what comes to Europe is very, very little numbers. So we have a lot of people moving inside Africa, where there are also zones of free movement of people, like in West Africa, for instance, in the Sahel. And you have people who try to find a better living moving from place to place, and only a few of them arrive to Europe. So our job market, as once Commissioner Gentiloni said, we are an aging society. We are an aging society, and we have less and less young people. We make less children. And of course, in front of us, there is Africa with the big numbers of people. And that's is what Professor Goodhart mentioned at the beginning. That's demand and supply. So we have for certain type of labors, demand, and we have a big supply from African countries or other countries, you know, like Southeast Asia or Latin America. So now my question to Professor Goodhart is a program like the Next Generation EU enough to relaunch Europe, or do we have to focus on other things to face the future challenges like innovation, or how do we face this difficult future in this globalized world? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Massimo Pronio. I think we are all done with the first round of interventions. And now I would ask Professor Goodhart to reply or even comment on something that was asked to him or something that he thinks is important to reply to. And then maybe we can open the floor to the audience here in the room. Thank you. Professor Goodhart, I would say 5 to 6 minutes. It's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me reply to the last query. It is absolutely correct that there is a huge increase in population in Africa. And the question of how relationships with Africa are managed is going to be crucial over the next few decades. People don't realize that yet, but it will soon come to be. Let me give one example. The population of Nigeria alone is going to be greater than the population of the whole of Europe very soon. The difficulty of having migration, physical migration of Africans to Europe is political and cultural rather than economic. I think that you are only too well aware of the politics of all that in Africa, in Italy. So I think that for political reasons, the likelihood of a mass migration out of Africa into Europe to solve Europe's labor problems is a very low probability for political reasons. That said, the next question is whether it's going to be possible to transport capital and managerial talents in large quantities to Africa, so that Africa can produce the goods of the world in place of China and export goods out of Africa produced by African labor to the rest of the world. And that depends basically on whether the African governments manage to manage their own economies sufficiently well. There's also a problem that Africa has got the same kind of population as India, but has got 50 different countries or so, many different languages, and it will be difficult to organize Africa to grow as fast as some of the other Asian countries did. I very much appreciated the presentation of Professor Testa. The only thing that I would say is that she concentrated really on the fertility, with which I had not, I entirely agreed with everything that she said. She didn't really say very much about handling the aged. And one of the problems about handling the aged is you cannot do it easily within the family group or by personal savings. And the reason for that is the amount of support that you need when you age is very much a gamble. And those who are relatively lucky are very fit until suddenly they die of heart failure in their sleep at 85. Well, the problem is that if you're unlucky, you can get dementia. And I really do feel that our focus on dementia is a key point of our book, that you can get dementia, say at age 80, and live for the next 10 or 11 years because it doesn't kill you. And the cost of that is far greater than any normal family can possibly undertake. And so there really is going to be necessary for the state to provide support for those who most need it, the incapacitated. Dr. Brandolini suggested there might be a cure. I wish that will happen. If it does, life will become, and our aging societies will become much better, and life and welfare in our societies will become much better. The problem is you cannot build policy on a hopeful, optimistic expectation that medicine and science will bring home the bacon, will solve our problems for us. Let us hope they will, but you cannot build current policy on an expectation that science will solve what it has tried to solve for many years and so far has almost entirely failed to do. And what I felt I should say.
Okay, thank you, Professor Goodhart. I'm thinking if there are any questions from students in the room. I see some hands already. Okay, we start from back there on the right, and maybe they should come here and just do it quick from here. Okay, just say your name and the quick question.
I'm Oriana, GG2, and I have a question for the Professor Brandolini. According to you, which kind of retirement system reform is needed right now in Italy?
Okay, we'll take some questions, and then if you can prepare. So we take some questions, I would say 4 or 5, and then we try to reply.
Hello, everyone. My name is Beatriz. I am a second-year student of global governance at the University of Tor Vergata, and I'm coming from Brazil. My question is, the smiling curve shows us how value adding varies across the production stages in the technology market, where the fabrication stage is in the lowest part of the curve. Considering the aging population and unlikely lack of working people in the future, how a higher participation of robots and technology can help to shrink or maybe increase the inequality of the countries, considering that most of the times the fabrication of devices are done in developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatriz. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for all the speakers for this very insightful session. My name is Noor Samara. I'm a second-year global governance student. My question is, with the increasing number of the old population, of course, the government expenditure on healthcare and consequently pensions will have to increase. What are the economic policies that should be taken in the future to tackle such challenges? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now the 4th question, then we stop and we have some replies.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So first of all, thanks for your speech. It was really interesting. I am Simone, I come from Italy. At one point you were talking about incentives to younger generation. At one point I started to think about an article I read regarding Spain, which started to give 250 euros per month. Okay. to younger generations to abandon their houses. We know that Italians are late at going out of their houses, and there are some policies that have been implemented in the last years, which we still don't know how much actually they worked or not, and we will only see that in maybe decades. But do you think that implementing even more disincentive to younger generation will solve the problem, or do you think that it will only tackle it a bit because it is more of a cultural problem?
Okay, thank you. I would say we could have Professor Brandolini could reply maybe to the questions about the pension system,
if he wants to, because he talked about it. Then Professor Goodhart, I would ask you to talk about the role of robots and technology in enhancing the labor force, because Brandolini already talked about it, so I would like to hear your opinion. And then maybe Professor Testa, she could reply to Simone about the cultural issues and demographics in Italy and how incentives might work. Okay, Professor Brandolini.
So many thanks. Just a clarification, I'm not professor. Thank you for that, but I'm not professor. The retirement what pension system for Italy. The Italian system is actually fair. That means that it is sustainable according to our macroeconomic projections in the future. There is an indexation to life expectancy that makes it a stable system. The point, there might be changes in the system to facilitate, in principle, an early exit, something that it has been discussed right now by politics, but always maintaining a strict correlation between contributions and pensions. So I think that the system we have now in Italy is sustainable, and there might be adjustments, but not substantial changes to maintain it a sustainable system. That's
okay. Professor Goodhart, maybe about the role of technology, artificial intelligence in sustaining the labor force. Thank you.
Well, I think that the point that was made that robots replace relatively unskilled labor and therefore raise inequality was a very good one. However, you mentioned just now artificial intelligence, and that will replace some activities that require mental effort. And therefore, it's not clear that the new technological developments, particularly AI, will have the effect on the on inequality that is as bad as robotics. And I would again say, with respect both to AI and to robotics, that we're going to need to shift a large proportion of the workforce to look after the aged. And sometimes people say, well, can't we get robots and AI to look after the aged? My answer to that one is no, because what the aged really require is human support, human empathy. And the empathy quotient of a robot is exactly 0. And again, if you have a robot appearing, you get exactly the same response irrespective. And that isn't what the old really want. The old want to be with people who look after them and care for them. And that you cannot get from a automatic robot or even, I believe, the likely development of AI.
Well, the cultural issue is at stake in Italy. We have these familistic roots, but the point is to what extent is the reason of this late transition to adulthood? Because it seems to me, at least in the last decades after the financial crisis in 2008, that there is this increasing youth unemployment rate and increasing uncertainty. Surveys show us that young Italians feel very uncertain in several fields of life. So they are not able to just plan their life, to set up a priority, you know. And I was, this is an anecdotal fact, I was very shocked after 20 years being abroad in Austria, in Vienna, to listen from my student in Rome, in Italy, professor. Very good, very smart, excellent students, very dynamic professor. We know that the only chance we have after completion of our study is to go abroad, to build up abroad our career. So I'm very well, I would encourage everybody to go abroad, but not just the last unique chance to build up a career or an autonomous life in the labor market. So I would say always there is cultural reason, but there is also an economic context that does not promote this anticipation in the transition.
Okay, thank you, Professor Testa. We still have 5 minutes. I don't know if there are any other questions. You might walk to the aisle here, and okay, you're next. Okay, so we take the last 3 questions, Professor Goodhart, and then I will also ask you a question, if I may.
Good afternoon, dear guests. Thank you for being here. So I'm Valerio Nejumi, a second-year global governance student in Roma Tor Vergata, University of Rome. So my question would be regarding a much more complex that is not maybe part of the near future, and is regarding overpopulation. So what should we expect in the maybe not so near future? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. My name is Michelle Pott. I'm also a second-year global governance student from Germany. And my question is about the ethics of having children in regards to climate change. At the moment, it seems very likely that the quality of life is going to be dramatically decreased year after year. In your opinion, does this ethical choice my generation is facing and other ethical choices, will it have an impact on the future population? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your speech, all the speakers. I have a question regarding the Italian solution for the shortage of labor. Since I have the poor knowledge on Italy's policies, I would like to about this. My name is Shinichi Mizuno. I'm a second-year student of global governance, and I'm from Japan. So I will talk about Japan a little bit. So Japan now is facing a super aging society. So we are facing the labor shortage, and we have problem patient because of the aging societies. And regarding the Japanese government now starting accepting immigrants, skilled immigrants and unskilled immigrants to cover the shortage of the problem, and also Japanese government also encourage women to participate in the workplaces, and also Japanese government also extended the retirement age of the workers. So as I said before, I don't have like poor knowledge on Italian policies. I would like to know introducing AI or encouraging women in the workplaces or accepting immigrants or extending the retirement ages. So which is which solution could be the best in your opinion to solve the shortage of laborers which Italian government we will see in the near futures? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Professor Goodhart, I would ask you to address the issues you want. I've heard about overpopulation, climate change, and then migration. And I would also add on this last question on immigration, you seem to figure in your book a more benign environment for the Western middle class, a more positive moment and phase after the big shock of China getting into the world trading system. I was wondering if you have a timing in mind of this betterment of conditions of the Western middle class, and also if you think that that will cause some change also in the political landscape, because if there will be also a great reversal of, for example, populism, or if that takes more time. Thank you.
I think the answer is that I wish that I knew the answers to these questions, but I certainly don't. It will depend on developments that have yet to come, as also that is true about the environment. I would just say that if we're going to deal with the environmental issues, which were raised most pertinently, we're going to have to undertake a great deal of investment. And that is going to have to be quite largely done through the public sector. And that is also going to add the inflationary context in which we're going to be living. I don't think that I've answered all the rest of the questions, but I will leave it to the other members of the panel to answer them. I was particularly taken with the environmental comment, because if there was one element that we did not touch in our book properly, and if we were to rewrite it, we certainly would extend much more, it would be the question of the environment and how we can deal with that, the investment that would be necessary to do that. And if there is much more need for that kind of investment, again, how we can finance it and what kind of taxation we need to introduce in order to do so with minimal effect upon our system. And also, just to finish, although we certainly believe that inflation will be higher and aggregate growth will be lower, we think that the pressures of a shortage of labor will lead to more investment because employers will be very keen to offset the rising unit labor costs, and that will lead to higher productivity. So the world that we see ahead will be one where output per worker and output per worker per hour will be actually higher. It may be a slower growing world, but it may be a less divided, less populist, less unequal, and it may be a happier world if we can also deal with the environmental issues, which remains uncertain.
Okay, thank you. One last comment from Massimo Bronio and maybe Professor Testa. No, non lo devi toccare, è acceso. Sì, è acceso.
Well, yeah, thanks. Well, no, in fact, the second question I heard from the student from Germany. Yeah. In fact, I think regarding climate change, the European Union in this, even if we are the continent which is producing less emission, it has had the strength to launch the Green Deal. And I think this, in this, I will not be modest, but I think in a way we are trying to lead by example. And we do that in the hope that other countries will follow. But of course, this is an issue of global governance, like the name of your course. So, but I think the Green Deal is something that we are really focusing on, and we are making a big effort in Europe, of course, with all our differences within Europe. But I think also the change in the US administration after President Biden was elected, 1 week after John Kerry was in Brussels, and he visited most European capitals. So I think this also the US are a key element in the addressing the issue of climate change with Europe. Thank you very much.
Just a small comment on the overpopulation issue. I just answer with the words of the regisseur Werner Both. He just had a movie several years ago, Population Boom. And at the end of the movie, he addressed this question: are we too many in the planet? If yes, who is too much? So this was provocative question, and he left it open just to say that, and I share his point of view, that today, more than an overpopulation problem, we are facing a problem with this unequal distribution of people on the planet, because many of the countries in the world are just projected to see a decline of their population. So just Concerning the climate change, you want me, may I add? Yeah, concerning the climate change, here, without going into technicalities, but it's true, more people means also more damage, so a threat for the environment, but we shouldn't forget that there is also technology on our side. So we actually impact on the environment if we are many, but we are in the position to use very refined and sophisticated technology, as we have seen in the last decade. So it's not just to say that it is not a deterministic relationship.
Allow me to suggest this really interesting book that's called 1 Billion Americans. It's written by Matthew Iglesias, a journalist expert in policy. And he basically says that if we are more, we have more innovation and we can basically do less damages on climate change. So it's an interesting point of view for me. Dr. Brandolini, not professor.
Thank you. No, I have very little to add because, as it was said, you asked so difficult questions that it is impossible for us to respond properly. So, but let me also stress one point in your questions. It was asked first about overpopulation, and then about shortages of labor, how to deal with them. So these are two completely opposite views of the same of the problems that we are facing. So that it shows the different perspectives, the different angles from which we could look at the demographic problems. So the only point I would like to make, not specific about policies, but two general points. The first one is that to treat all these issues of population, climate change, and so forth, we need to think in global terms. The issue of global governance that was mentioned is critical. The approach of the book by Goodhart is exactly that. Goodhart and Pradhan is exactly that of taking this global view. And let me say that Italy used its Italian presidency of G20 to push forward actions again on these issues, climate change, but there must be coordination at the global level, and that is difficult to achieve. So that is the first point. The second point that I would like to make before closing is that I'm an economist, the statisticians, or I don't know exactly, demographer and so on. We all have expertise on certain fields. You will have one in the future. But when you discuss these big issues, it is not only a matter of technicalities of the model that you use to describe the economy. You have to introduce in your reasoning the ethical values, what you think the society should be. Some of the technical answers cannot be separated from the ethical views. And sometimes forgetting about this point brings us in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this was a perfect closer. And thank you also for all of your attention and your great questions. And okay, talk to you soon and see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Tak? Okay. Guys, please don't forget to sign.